Welcome to this video on the third exercise on our fourth assignment in our course Competition Policy and Strategy. Now this third exercise is on the topic of competition policy, and within this exercise we want to familiarize ourselves with some facts and considerations concerning competition policy. Let's dive right into it. So first, to what extent can the existence of market power affect the efficiency of the market? And then, what forms of efficiency should be given particular attention? Let's first start with the first question. So, to what extent can the existence of market power affect the efficiency in the market? Let's have a look at market power in order to answer this question. So, when we're talking about market power, what we are referring to is the possibility or the ability to profitably increase market price above a price level that would be in a more competitive, maybe perfectly competitive environment. Okay? This provides us with one way of capturing market power or measuring market power, namely the common unit of measurement of market power, which is the difference in market price and marginal costs. So the profit margin, so to speak. All right. Now, so what this means is market power, basically, think of market power equals increased prices. Increased prices then result in reduced quantities. That's simply true by a negatively sloped demand function, where every increment in price comes with a decrease in demanded quantity for these prices. And as we have seen in previous exercises, well, this increase in price and this reduction in quantity, which of course is equivalent by having a look at the demand function, comes with a loss in welfare. So this already is part of the answer of the second part of the question as well. What forms of efficiency should be given particular attention? Well, allocative efficiency is one form of this efficiency, which regards the total welfare that results from the market equilibrium. Furthermore, increased prices might be necessary in order to make research and development profitable. Right? Research and development are usually considered to be are usually modeled as part of the cost function, or can be understood as an additional cost that the firm has to incur if it wants to spend on research and development. And in case we have zero economic profits, that of course means that there is simply no profits, no positive profits that would allow for such spendings. All right. If, however, we cannot have investment in research and development, and one way, of course, is one way to model investments in research and development is what we did in the previous exercises, where we always assume that there is some technology out there which a firm can invest into and thereby increase their marginal costs, right? But if there is no profits left that can be spent on these investments into technologies, well then cost reductions are not feasible to the market. And this then affects the dynamic efficiency of the market. So just think of, or just maybe as a reminder, think of the previous exercise 4.2, where we considered a scenario where firms had the opportunity, or where it was possible for a firm to make an investment into a firm, thereby decrease their own marginal costs. And we saw in this previous exercise that this can only happen, or that this is only then a profitable choice, a profit maximizing choice, in case the firm can expect increased profits. And by the logic of this argument, then this of course means a gain in market power as well. Then third and finally, increased prices might be the result of efficiency. And this, of course, is very closely related to what we just discussed. So for example, if one firm has cost advantages, then this firm, as we have modeled or shown in previous models throughout this course, then this firm might yield a positive profit margin, which of course is, in the sense of what we have just discussed, a measurement for market power. Yeah. Increase the market price above the price level in perfect competition. So in case we observe a positive profit margin, this might well be the result of a cost advantage, which of course is something desirable in the sense of productive efficiency in the market. All right. Let's now consider task B. We are now asked to describe what is meant by the consumer welfare standard and the total welfare standard. We are asked what are the arguments for and against measuring market efficiency in the terms of consumer surplus and total welfare respectively. All right, so one thing builds upon the other. The second question, of course, immediately builds on the first question. So let's ask them in this order. First question first, second question right after that. So what is the consumer welfare standard? And in very simple terms, put into very simple terms, the consumer welfare standard means that the competition authority should maximize the consumer surplus. So that maximizing consumer surplus is the objective of the competition authority. Now, what are arguments for or against measuring market efficiency using this metric, namely the consumer welfare standard? Well, first of all, whether or not we want to only consider the consumer's surplus is a normative question. There is no positive answer to this. The normative question is, well, should consumer's utility be favored? Is consumer's utility the one and only important measurement? And that, of course, cannot be answered in a positive way. This is by nature a normative question, which you can and will debate. Then, how could this consumer welfare standard work? Well, one strategy would be to focus on consumer surplus in order to maximize the total welfare. All right. There's two ways how this can be achieved, or how we can walk towards this goal, or how a competition authority rather could walk towards this goal. And the first one would be to reduce the influence of firms onto the decisions, that is, to reduce the role of lobbyism, or to reduce information advantages. This usually refers to information asymmetries that are between consumers and firms. One way to increase the consumer surplus would be to reduce these information advantages that firms typically have in this situation. And then the second and final note on consumer welfare standard is that it might be advantage. It might be of advantage to consider this standard because it's simply easier to measure. You don't need to consider efficiency gains. You don't need to consider changes in the cost functions by any change in the market structure, anything like this. We don't have to think of a digression of fixed costs, which of course comes with an increase in firm size, but rather we can just ignore all of these aspects of the market and simply focus only on the consumer surplus. So it is in this sense an objective that might be easier to follow. Now, the second possible, or the alternative standard which we will have a look at is the total welfare standard. Let's again first start by defining what we mean with the total welfare standard. And what we mean is that the competition authority, in case they would follow the total welfare standard, competition authorities should maximize the total welfare, that is, the sum of consumer surplus and profits. All right, so the consumer surplus is of course not fully ignored. So the consumer surplus, which was the sole and only objective of the consumer welfare standard, is of course not ignored in this total welfare standard, but rather it is one aspect among two, namely consumer surplus and profits. All right, so how can we evaluate this? What are the pros and cons of the total welfare standard? Well, first argument pro or in favor of the total welfare standard is that this aims to achieve allocative efficiency, which means the total welfare in the market is maximized, and conceptually this means that the total welfare of all participants in a market is maximized, and not only from one half or one side rather of the market. All right, this total welfare standard is typically considered the main objective by mainstream economics, which is a very difficult statement in its own, and has to be, of course, taken with a grain of salt. But I would argue, in general, this is the objective that is followed by mainstream economics. However, well, we already talked about what are the issues with measuring consumer surplus when in the context of the consumer welfare standard. So let's now have a look at what are the additional issues or potential obstacles when considering the producer's surplus, or in other words, the profits of the firms in the market. Well, one advantage would be that this now focuses on stake and shareholders. So now, again, this comes back to the idea that now all participants in the market are considered, or the welfare of all participants in the market is now considered. And another advantage, another advantage of this approach would be that it allows to include dynamic efficiency into our considerations. So if we were to only maximize the consumer welfare or consumer surplus, if we were to follow the consumer welfare standard, then of course allowing for a positive profit that then allows for investment into R&D can never be part of this objective. However, if profits of the firms are now part of our objective function, then of course we can consider changes in profits by a policy, and we can consider expected price reductions due to research and development. We can consider effects that are under the topic of dynamic efficiency in the market. All right. In task C, we are now leaving the topic of the objective function of the competition authority, but rather we want to get a better understanding of the terms rule of reason and per se rule. And then we are asked to define these these terms, and then we are asked to give examples of applications of the per se rule. All right, so a rule of reason would or could be a general rule of interpretation of the Sherman Act. So, of course, what the Sherman Act is, you should know from the lecture. It's basically the rule book for the competition authority, speaking in layman's terms. And a rule of reason would be an interpretation, a general rule of interpretation on the Sherman Act. A rule of reason would yield in a situation where agreements between firms would only be prohibited if they are unreasonable or if their interference with economic freedom of action would be unreasonable. So what this means is we can weigh the pros and cons of some kind of agreement, and in case the negative effects are just unreasonably large, considering the positive effects, then we can make a rule of reason, make an argument that this agreement should not be allowed or should be prohibited. In contrast to the rule of reason, then there is so-called per se rules. So per se rules are usually applied to very specific behaviors which have been declared to be per se, so basically in any case, unacceptable. So just to name a few examples, an agreement on prices is always prohibited. An agreement on prices between firms is always prohibited. So there is really no weighting pro and cons, but there is some actions, some forms of agreements which are just generally ruled out and generally not allowed. The same is of course is true for production restrictions, for boycotts, for coordinated refusals to supply a downstream firm, and for tying. Just some examples for per se rules in the Sherman Act.